This is Liberty Law Talk, part of Liberty Fund's online library of law and liberty. Your host is Liberty Fund Fellow Richard Reinsch. Our web address is libertylawsite.org, where you can subscribe, comment, find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org. Today we are discussing with Professor Daniel Mahoney Alexis de Tocqueville's modest defense of American constitutionalism. Professor Mahoney is the Augustin Chair in Distinguished Scholarship at Assumption College. He has written widely on Alexis de Tocqueville and is also an expert on French political thought and anti-totalitarian thought. He is the author of, among other books, Alexander Solzhenitsyn, The Ascent from Ideology, Bertrand de Juvenel, The Conservative Liberal, and the Illusions of Modernity. He is also the author of The Conservative Foundations of the Liberal Order, Defending Democracy Against Its Modern Enemies and Immoderate Friends. Dan Mahoney, welcome to the show.
Oh, my pleasure to be here.
Professor Mahoney, why does Alexis de Tocqueville come to America and put together the series of essays that becomes Democracy in America?
The ostensible reason for Tocqueville's trip to North America was he and his travel companion and best friend, Gustave de Beaumont, had been commissioned to investigate American prisons, and in fact in 1833 published a work on the penitentiary system in the United States. But that was really the occasion. Both of them were deeply interested in pursuing the study of this new democracy, which they thought, where they thought democracy had reached its limits, and therefore revealed something about the character of the democratic revolution that was still unfolding in Europe. So, if you read Tocqueville's work, you'll always see there's these tripartite comparisons he makes between France on the one hand, which has been ravaged by modern revolution, England, or more aristocratic society that has nonetheless perfectly evolved in the direction of modern liberty, and then the United States of America, where the democratic revolution had revealed its most salutary traits. So I think for Tocqueville it was really important to see America, to understand the way in which the democratic revolution had revealed its most positive features, most positive face in the United States.
In the opening of Volume 1, he has this phrase, point of departure, which he develops about the American system. What is the point of departure of American liberty and also of American order according to Tocqueville?
Yeah, Tocqueville doesn't begin in 1787 with the constitutional founding, even though he has a very long treatment of the framing and the Constitution in Volume 1. He doesn't begin with the Declaration of Independence in 1776. In fact, he's silent about the Declaration of Independence in Democracy in America. He begins with the point of departure, which he identifies with the Puritan settlement in the United States. In fact, he talks about 2 points of departure, one in the South with Virginia, where you had adventurers who very much in the sort of, imbued with the mercantilist spirit, who wanted to get gold and this and that. And he said that, and they eventually introduced slavery. And Tocqueville makes clear that that's not the fundamental point of departure he has in mind. The fundamental point of departure he has in mind is the Puritan settlement of New England. And with the Puritans, he sees he sees a settlement that perfectly combines the spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion. He emphasizes the fact that the Puritans, on the one hand, were committed to the most democratic and republican theories of politics, that they had introduced self-government, the direct participation of citizens in the making of laws in a very direct way. On the other hand, he says sometimes their mores were informed by what he calls bizarre and tyrannical laws. So he knows that the Americans after 1776 have departed in some fundamental ways from the kind of conservative religiosity that had informed the Puritans. But on the other hand, the Puritans remained models in 2 decisive regards. One was the fact that they had introduced the citizen spirit democratic participation in a particularly admirable way. And secondly, they had provided a model for thinking about what Tocqueville calls the marvelous combination of the spirit of religion and the spirit of the spirit of liberty. And so the Puritans for Tocqueville are precisely that, a point of departure. They're not, to look at the Puritan point of departure is not to understand exactly where Americans are, and America becomes a more liberal polity in the course of 100 or 200 years. But nonetheless, there's something to be learned from the way the Puritans managed to combine Republican institutions with the spirit of religion.
So this kind of produces several questions that I think a lot of people have, and I want to ask you, just coming out of your remarks right now, why is the Declaration of Independence something that Tocqueville is silent about? And also the Constitution, not working that into his remarks of American settlement. This seems to produce a lot of criticisms, and also the Puritan spirit. You mentioned democratic participation, and yet many would say that he reduces America really to one narrow founding instead of something that might be more historically accurate, of competing foundings or several participatory foundings. How do you respond to those questions?
Well, on the several participatory foundings, as I mentioned, Tocqueville is fully aware that the Puritan point of departure is not an exclusive point of departure. He gives a good deal of time in the chapter on the point of departure to the Southern or Virginian founding of the United States, but he also knows that that founding is fundamentally flawed because it's informed by non-democratic impulses, ultimately culminating in slavery. As for the silence on the Declaration of Independence, I don't think it's as big a deal as some people make it out to be. I think among other, Tocqueville's concentration really is on two American foundings. One, the Puritan settlement of the United States, and then two, the constitutional founding of America. He has a very, very long chapter on the federal constitution, chapter 8 of volume 1 of Democracy in America. And there's reasons, I think, for his. I mean, he does refer to the Declaration of Independence in some of his letters. He actually attended a 4th of July ceremony in Albany, New York, and where the Declaration of Independence was read, and he comments on this in a letter back home, but he makes nothing of it on the level of ideas. I think Tocqueville was concerned that especially in a French context, he was worried that liberty be reduced to abstract declarations. The French had their famous Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen from the summer of 1789, and that declaration did nothing to stop the drift of the French Revolution toward, a kind of totalitarian democracy. So, there was particularly a French and European tendency toward abstraction. Understand liberty not in its concreteness, not in terms of political liberty practiced by free citizens, but instead in terms of the invocation of abstract ideas that were perfectly compatible, abstract, or what Tocqueville later calls general ideas that were perfectly compatible with new forms of despotism. So from his point of view, the last thing in the world the French needed to hear was that the essence of American liberty was an abstract declaration of rights. The French had precisely such an abstract declaration of rights in 1789, and as I said a moment ago, it did nothing to stop the drift toward a certain kind of revolutionary despotism.
No, point taken. Let me ask you, Tocqueville, you mentioned the section in the first volume of on the Constitution. So what does Tocqueville think about these two informing ideas of federalism and separation of powers? Does he see them as something that have been kind of crafted out of a lived American experience, or is this something geometrically laid down by political theorists within the founding?
Well, I mean, he's fully aware. Tocqueville, throughout Democracy in America, speaks of this mysterious character he calls the legislator. And the legislator is, somebody responsible for the founding of a political order. So Tocqueville, unlike, let's say, a certain reading of Burke, doesn't, it has no opposition to the idea that a political order sometimes its laws, its constitution need to be instituted. They need to be founded. They don't simply develop organically from past precedents. So to that extent, Tocqueville is not an opponent of general ideas. On the other hand, he's fully cognizant of the fact that the Federal Constitution of 1787 grew out of a prior American tradition of self-government. And so, unlike the French in the years after 1789, who tried to establish a new political order ex nihilo, the Americans were drawing upon and developing from a centuries-old tradition of democratic self-government in the colonies. Tocqueville, I think Tocqueville had, Chapter 8 is a good chapter. It's a nice account of the Federal Constitution and its institutions. It's not, it seems to me, one of the most, the deepest or most penetrating of the chapters in Democracy in America. An American sometimes has a feeling we know all that already, but about federalism, Tocqueville places, he talks less about federalism and more about the importance of local institutions. Tocqueville insists in Volume 1 of Democracy in America that there can be no liberty without what he calls provincial liberties. So his emphasis is, he certainly talks up federalism as a fundamental feature of free government, constitutional government in the United States. He's a friend of federalism. He gives an almost anti-federalist reading of the Federalist, of the founding. That the framers went out of their way not only to create a consolidated republic, but also to maintain strong elements of federalism. And the emphasis, when Tocqueville talks about federalism, the emphasis is on local liberty. And he has some beautiful discussions in both Volume 1 and Volume 2 of Democracy of the way in which active participation by citizens in local government allows people to be citizens and not what he calls administered subjects. And so that distinction between the citizen and the administered subject is central to Tocqueville's larger reflection about federalism and provincial liberty.
So the strength of democratic governance is something that Tocqueville writes a lot about in Volume 1, and yet there's also this famous phrase of tyranny of the majority that everyone quotes and discusses that's present right after a chapter on the strength of democratic governance. What is this tyranny that he's discussing? Why is American democracy subject to it? What resources are there that Tocqueville cites that are within the American constitutional experience to protect against it?
Yeah, well, that's a great question. Tocqueville was fully cognizant of the fact that that majority rule had within it a propensity to undermine human liberty. He speaks about the impious maxim that anything majorities do in the name of improvement of society is legitimate. And he's the first, I think, really to, well, there were other French liberal thinkers who, on the basis of the French Revolutionary experience, were aware of and critical of the tendency of to justify tyranny in the name of majority rule. It seems to me Tocqueville's treatment is the most famous and most dramatic account of the illiberalism inherent in a certain kind of majoritarianism. I think where his analysis stands out is that Tocqueville repeatedly makes clear throughout Democracy in America that there is no alternative to the sovereignty of the people, that any effort to think about the problem of tyranny of the majority has to start with the fact that any recourse to an aristocratic politics or an extra-democratic politics that tries to address this problem by recourse to something outside of democracy itself is bound to fail. And so that's the problem that Tocqueville sets up for us. On the one hand, all the solutions to the problem of the tyranny of the majority have to be established on democratic grounds or foundations. On the other hand, and I think Tocqueville argues something like this, that the problem of tyranny of the majority can be addressed adequately well on political grounds. In other words, you can have checks and balances and separation of powers and various constitutional means of preventing tyrannical majorities from exercising their power. I think where Tocqueville finds the tyranny of the majority to be most unsettling is in the area of thought. In fact, Tocqueville says, kind of rather surprisingly for a reader of democracy, you're reading along, you've had this, generally quite favorable exposition of American democracy throughout the work, and then Tocqueville says in a chapter following the famous chapter on tyranny of the majority that there's no country in the world where there's less freedom of thought than in the United States of America. And Tocqueville, in a famous paragraph says, well, if you disagree with the majority, where do you go? If you appeal the political authorities, those are the political authorities based on the majority. If you appeal the public opinion, it's based on the majority. That there's no group, there's no voice, there's no spiritual traditions that one can ultimately appeal to that are not firmly grounded in the majority sentiment. And so those are, I think, some of the darkest passages in Democracy in America, the thought that Tocqueville presents that somehow when it comes to the life of the mind, there is no resort, there's no equivalent of separation of powers or checks and balances that can defend authentic freedom of thought in a democratic age.
And thinking about the majority opinion that you're discussing and how it can say stifle creative thought or free thought, he opens volume 2 with an inquiry into the philosophical approach of the Americans. So what is this philosophical approach, Dan?
Well, Tocqueville famously says that the Americans are Cartesians without ever having read Descartes. And what he's referring to is the reason I think why he calls the philosophical method of the Americans Cartesian is because, like Descartes had evoked in the Discourse on Method, the need to doubt all inherited opinions, traditions, etc. And that's exactly what he says Americans naturally do. So that the American method, the American philosophical method, is one which is suspicious of all inherited maxims, traditions, etc. It begins from pure reason itself. And by the way, it's really interesting in that opening chapter of Democracy in America, Tocqueville paints a portrait of the gradual rise of what we might call philosophical skepticism in Europe. He said, even though Luther firmly believed in scriptural truths, yet there was a kind of distrust of tradition. So with the Reformation, one has the first moment in the history of European and democratic skepticism. That's followed by Descartes and his new method, which of course was circumscribed for a time, but over time would give rise to a more thoroughgoing philosophical and political skepticism. And then one arrives finally at the French Enlightenment. Tocqueville evokes Voltaire. Voltaire, of course, famously said, "Écrasez l'infâme," crush the infamous thing, right? So you have this thoroughgoing skepticism applied to the religious realm. But Tocqueville points out that the Americans are qualified Cartesians. And what he means by that is that their doubt is moderated by a certain religious affirmation and commitment. So Tocqueville, in the chapter that follows the chapter on the philosophical method of the Americans, discusses dogmatic beliefs and how human beings need them. Even philosophers need them. No one will be able to get out of bed we take 100 things a day on faith. To reduce everything in life to pure reason and calculation is to leave ourselves extremely vulnerable to a kind of democratic vertigo. We're told we're absolutely free, we don't know what to do, and we end up taking our bearings from the tyranny of public opinion. And Tocqueville's answer to that problem is faith, that religious faith provides a firm foundation for human freedom. It allows one to overcome what I've just described as that democratic vertigo, that excessive freedom that gets in the way of human beings using their freedom in a responsible and effective manner. So that chapter on the philosophical method of the Americans has to be understood as a qualified account of the Cartesianism of the Americans, because Tocqueville makes clear we're Cartesians 5 or 6 days of the week, but we're also men of religious faith 1 or 2 days of the week, and that tension between the American affirmation of dogmatic beliefs on the one hand and that larger skepticism toward tradition on the other, that tension or antinomy tells us so much about the American soul, the American spirit.
Let me ask you, so you're discussing qualified Cartesianism as a method of the Americans, according to Tocqueville, but there's also this other tendency, which has been termed democratic pantheism, which sounds like such a strange term. Talk about this for a minute, and how this seems to really play into certain tendencies of democracy and sort of its darker aspects that Tocqueville analyzes.
Yeah, Tocqueville has a very little but important chapter in the first part of volume 2 of Democracy in America. Deals with the influence of democracy on intellectual life in the United States. And Tocqueville has a little chapter 7, called What Makes the Mind of Democratic Peoples Lean Toward Pantheism. Pantheism, strictly speaking, is the doctrine that there's no fundamental distinction between God and the world. Pantheistic doctrines, there's certain thinkers, German thinkers like Hegel, the Dutch philosopher Benedict Spinoza, and others, certain French contemporaries of Tocqueville, such as Lamartine and Quinet, who were pantheists, who essentially abolished the distinction between God and the universe, man, God, and the universe. They were obsessed, as Tocqueville puts it, with the idea of unity. Tocqueville is worried about pantheism because he fears that it will destroy human individuality, that man will simply become a speck in this larger universe, that God and the otherness of God, the providence of God, will simply become some kind of universal force. And much as he says democratic historians attribute everything to great general causes and to inflexible a fatality or a blind providence, so he says the pantheists attribute everything to some kind of universal force which is indistinguishable from the world itself. What's so striking about the chapter on pantheism is Tocqueville ends, it's a very brief paragraph, chapter 6 or 7 paragraphs, and yet Tocqueville ends it by saying that this is the doctrine most likely to seduce the human mind in democratic centuries, and that all who remain enamored of the genuine greatness of man should unite and do combat against it. So Tocqueville is deeply concerned by this pantheistic drift within democracy. And by the way, I should say that not only is pantheism a theological error that in a way radically conflates God and the world, but it also has larger human and political consequences. You might say the political corollary of cosmopolitanism is that tendency to swallow up individuals and nations in the world. Think of that impulse, we are the world, where individual and national differences shouldn't get in the way of the unity of the human race. So I think Tocqueville sees in pantheism a dangerous threat to the integrity of the individual. And one could think through, as I said a moment ago, some of the political consequences of pantheism.
Thinking of some of those consequences, it would seem we already have an American instance of that close to the time of Tocqueville's visit, which would have been the Transcendentalists. And the sense of they had had a strong sense of individuality, but ultimately that individuality was because of a believed divine spark within them that enabled them to question tradition around them, political forms around them, in the name of the higher truth they thought they were called to.
Emerson's world soul.
Yeah, or maybe even any of the progressives, you could argue, had an instance of this in wanting to abolish political distinctions in favor of some sort of equality or progress that we're marching towards, etc. I was thinking, so we think of individualism as a good thing. For Tocqueville, it's not necessarily, and it's problematic within a democracy. Is this related to the pantheism that he's concerned about? Yeah.
The way I like to put it is Tocqueville is a unquestioned partisan of human individuality, of his holy enterprise, he says near the end of Volume 2 of Democracy in America, was to defend the liberty and greatness of human beings. So he's second to none in defending genuine human individuality. The reason he fears pantheism, the reason he fears what he calls democratic individualism in Volume 2, Part 2, Chapter 4 of Democracy is because that individualism actually makes human beings weaker and therefore less capable of directing themselves, governing themselves. Tocqueville defines individualism, and he was one of the first persons to popularize the word. The Tocqueville scholar James Schleifer says he didn't invent the term, but he gave it in some sense a new meaning with his discussion in Volume 2 of Democracy in America. So individualism is this apathetic withdrawal from the larger public world, where and Tocqueville describes it not as a moral fault like egoism or selfishness, but as a cognitive error. In other words, people somehow exaggerate their independence. They don't understand that they're social and political animals. They lose the capacity to see the world around them in a clear light, to truly appreciate the virtues and vices of human beings. And Tocqueville is one of a series of conservative-minded liberal thinkers who thinks that there's an intimate connection between individualism on the one hand and collectivism on the other. When the bonds or ties of human beings fray, when the intermediate institutions between the individual and the state are weakened, one is simply left with what he calls the immense being of the state on the one hand and a series of disconnected individuals on the other. And Tocqueville's fear is, as he puts it, that people will get lost in the solitude of their own heart, that they will fail to appreciate and understand the fundamental bonds and connections that define us as human beings. And that's why political liberty is so important for Tocqueville, because political liberty is a constant reminder that we live in the world with other human beings, a constant reminder that our individuality is always tied to a social and political setting that gives it roots and gives it a firm foundation.
Let me ask you, so we talked about these concepts, and thinking of Tocqueville also limbs several resources for correction to try to ameliorate these negative tendencies of democracy. And we've mentioned one in religion, but there's also this doctrine of self-interest rightly understood. There's also democratic family life, and also self-government and participation in local self-government as a way of elevation out of this problem of individualism. Could you talk about those concepts and how they might differ in certain respects from the way we think of ourselves as American Democrats?
Sure. So much of Volume 2 of Democracy in America is centered around those antidotes to democratic individualism. And by the way, if those Tocqueville seems to suggest something like this, that democracy has a nature, and that nature drifts toward despotism of a certain sort, whether the power of one alone, a term he uses all the time to describe something like Napoleonic despotism, or that soft or mild despotism he describes in the penultimate chapter of Democracy. So the democracy left unchecked, it will culminate in an individualism that risks giving rise to collectivism. So Tocqueville spends an awful lot of Volume 2 discussing, as you said, antidotes to individualism. One chapter, for example, is called How the Americans Combat Individualism with Free Institutions. And the free institutions Tocqueville is talking about here are primarily local institutions. And Tocqueville in this chapter praises the American founders for not establishing an excessively centralized polity, but establishing a federal republic that left room for self-government at the local level. He also makes, Tocqueville is famous for his invocation of what he calls the infinite art, that infinite art which is the art of association. And he draws this beautiful his beautiful discussion at the beginning of his chapter on the use Americans make of the associations. He says, Americans form associations for everything. He says, to celebrate feasts and to send missionaries to the North and South Pole and to establish hospitals. And he goes through this laundry list, and he even later on in that chapter mentions the temperance movement, a movement trying to get people not to drink, right? So this is that it was precisely through this art of association that Americans were able to overcome the debilities of individualism. And he contrasts the American art of association with the situation in France and in England. He says in France, faced with similar kinds of problems, people would turn to the government. So the first impulse was not to associate freely. The first impulse was to turn to the state to take care of the problem. And then he says in England, people would turn to a great lord, England having a more aristocratic form of liberty than that found in the United States. So that passage, I think, is very revealing. And Tocqueville says that he calls the art of association the science mère, the mother science of freedom in the United States. It's the fundamental science at the heart of everything else. It's the ability to associate in those myriad ways that he describes in that chapter that make possible a rich intermediate realm between the state and the individual. And it's precisely the erosion of that rich intermediate realm which is, the precondition for the development of a new form of democratic despotism. Now, other antidotes, you mentioned self-interest rightly understood. A lot of people read Democracy in America and they sort of reduce Tocqueville's practical, moral, and political teaching to a defense of self-interest rightly understood. I think if one looks closely at Tocqueville's discussion, he makes clear that Americans are better than their philosophy. He says sometimes Americans don't do justice to themselves. Americans are quite capable of generosity, of philanthropy, of magnanimity, but we have a tendency to reduce our generosity to a kind of utilitarian calculus or to self-interest rightly understood. So Tocqueville says self-interest rightly understood is one means of, I quote, enlarging the human heart. You begin with where people are. The self-interest rightly understood says that the people that it's in your interest to be a citizen. It's in your interest to be a philanthropist. It's in your interest to overcome the solitude of the human heart. And while Tocqueville thinks that self-interest rightly understood is an important tool of the statesman, and it's an important, you might say, moral and psychological teaching in a democratic age, a true morality of human nature, a true morality of democracy goes beyond it. So it's an important moment. You're absolutely right that it's self-interest rightly understood can be a corrective to democratic individualism. It can, in its own limited way, help enlarge the human heart. On the other hand, it's not Tocqueville's final word on morality. And then you mentioned religion. Religion plays a very important role in Volume 1 of Democracy, but it also shows up again in Volume 2. Tocqueville we saw as a real deep critic of pantheism. He's also a deep critic of all forms of philosophical and practical materialism. He says he'd rather, there's more truth in the doctrine of metempsychosis, the reincarnation, that human beings come back as pigs or that kind of thing, than there is in the philosophical materialism of a Spinoza. So Tocqueville sees religion as a constant reminder to human beings, not only of their moral obligations, but they live in a world governed not simply by doubt, but by certain, by divine providence, religion, like these other antidotes, takes human beings out of themselves and therefore makes democratic liberty more possible. Tocqueville is very clear that the great effect of religion on American liberty is an indirect one. He doesn't want the lesson of Europe is there's a danger when religion becomes too tied to a particular body politic. When that body politic becomes superannuated, as was the case with the French whole regime, then religion itself is discredited. But the important thing, even though in various places Tocqueville describes religion and the family and local liberty as aristocratic inheritances, and that would suggest that as antidotes to individualism, we're drawing on something that comes from outside of democracy, that precedes the democratic revolution, which is the theme of democracy in America. But Tocqueville also says religion is natural to the human heart. It's as natural, there's an immutable point in the human heart that is, and it's as natural, he says, as hope itself. So if religion were just a leftover from the Puritans or from the Christian heritage of the West, we might ask ourselves how useful it would be for revivifying the spirit of freedom, bringing the spirit of liberty and the spirit of religion together. But because it's rooted in human nature, it's rooted in the human impulse to hope and to believe in a transcendent realm, then religion, Tocqueville's confident religion has staying power. That it's not simply a question of wasting capital, where religion will eventually fray and go away. It seems to me that's the dominant belief among elites in Western Europe today, that religion is something that's eventually going to sort of just go away. But Tocqueville had a kind of confidence in its staying power because it was not merely an aristocratic inheritance, but it was also something natural to the human heart.
Professor Mahoney, I wanted to talk briefly. Tocqueville's writings have been prominently featured recently in the last few years, and of course, over the course of American intellectual historians, he's been more prominent and less prominent in the weight given him and the value ascribed to his observations. I wanted to discuss this contemporary revival of interest in Tocqueville. And of course, it seems to correlate or be caused by certain events in our country, but also maybe even more. Maybe there's even something else going on in terms of why publications are reprinting chapters from Democracy in America, having feature pieces, etc. I wanted to read, however, we've been talking about resources for correction, and yet he ends Democracy in America. Towards the end, with the chapter, What Sort of Despotism Democratic Nations Have to Fear. There's a sentence in there, a couple of sentences I wanted to read and get your reaction to. And he's talking about the government here in a democratic country. He says, it covers the whole of social life with a network of petty, complicated rules that are both minute and uniform, through which even men of the greatest originality and the most vigorous temperament cannot force their heads above the crowd. It does not break men's will, but softens, bends, and guides it. It seldom enjoins, but often inhibits, action. It does not destroy anything, but prevents much being born. It is not at all tyrannical, but it hinders, restrains, enervates, stifles, and stultivates so much that in the end each nation is no more than a flock of timid and hard-working animals with the government as its shepherd. Thoughts on that passage, and also kind of the broader question.
I call that Tocqueville's nightmare. The French word is cauchemar. Tocqueville's not saying that the rise of a new kind of democratic despotism. He says, in fact, he doesn't really have a word for it. It's not despotism or tyranny. in the traditional sense, but it's a new, mild form of despotism marked by these pestiferous regulations and by this effort to keep human beings in eternal childhood. So this is Tocqueville's fear of where democracy is heading unless the art of liberty is strengthened, revivified, allowed to do its work. There are some contemporary students of Tocqueville, Paul Ray most notably in his recent book, Democracy's Drift, who read this chapter as a kind of description of European social democracy and increasingly a description of our own welfare state. And there's something to those kinds of readings of Tocqueville, but I don't think Tocqueville was trying to be a prophet in this chapter so much as providing a salutary warning against certain tendencies that, if left unchecked, might culminate in this kind of despotism. So I look upon that famous description of democratic despotism as precisely a salutary warning. The other thing I think worth mentioning is Tocqueville himself was not a critic of the welfare state per se. In his writings on French politics, he was a very strong critic of socialism. In fact, the phrase "road to serfdom" that Hayek, the title of Hayek's book, 1944 book, his famous critique of the drift towards serfdom in modern states, was actually taken from an 1848 speech by Tocqueville on the speech on the right to work, which was Tocqueville's fullest and critique of socialism. But in that 1848 speech, Tocqueville says, look, the French Republic needs to be social. It needs to help provide for the poor. He's not against public charity, but what he's against is the confiscation of independence, the excessive materialism, the excessive statism that marks a socialist solution to the human problem. I think that distinction is important. You can read that penultimate chapter, Democracy in America, in a kind of hyper-libertarian way. Tocqueville was not a libertarian, but he was deeply sensitive toward the drift toward pestiferous regulations, government control, an enervation of the human spirit, all those things he associated with the new despotism. There's also, if you look at the end of that chapter, and it's very, very easy just to look at that passage you read because it's so evocative and so descriptive, but if you look at the end of the chapter, Tocqueville says he sees this new despotism, this soft despotism or mild despotism, as a kind of ephemeral monster. And what he means by that is it can't last for very long. He says the combination of freely elected institutions, Republican institutions, with this kind of monstrous état-provident providential state, that it's either going to give, it's going to become a full despotism, or there's going to be a return to freer institutions. So I think that's interesting to see that Tocqueville thought that there was an incompatibility of mild despotism with the spirit of a free people, and that eventually a people would have to choose whether or not they were going to be truly free, or whether or not they were going to subject themselves to a form of democracy that is in fact despotic.
Interesting as well. I mean, there's a lot of discussion of Tocqueville, a lot of discussion of his writings about administrative despotism and over-centralization, and yet I think an honest look at the state of most liberal democracies in the West would have to say it's going to be harder to keep centralizing, given that so much has been done already. We seem to be running out of money, if not bodies, to pave a new road to serfdom. So in a way, Tocqueville's observations are apt, but yet seeing sort of this an ongoing administrative despotism seems to be short-lived at best.
That's right. That was certainly his own view.
Professor Mahoney, thank you for being with us and discussing Alexis de Tocqueville and his writings on the American Republic.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you very much, Richard.
This is your host, Richard Greinch, and you have been listening to a podcast that can be found at libertylawsite.org. where you can subscribe, comment, and find other episodes and links related to today's conversation. Our email address is lal@libertyfund.org.